Doug, thank you so much for joining us this morning. I really appreciate you taking out the time. And I wanted to invite you as a Presbyterian, as a Christian pastor, to be part of this conversation because we're talking about Jesus. And Unitarian Universalists pretty famously have a wide variety of beliefs about who Jesus was and who Jesus is. So I wanted to start this conversation by asking you, as a Christian, who do you understand Jesus to be?
Excellent. I'm glad you started with an easy question. We could breeze right through. One thing I want to mention is that, as you said, I'm a Presbyterian pastor. I'm a lifelong Presbyterian. I'm sure there isn't as much diversity on a Sunday morning for us as there is for you of who or what people think Jesus is, but there is definitely significant diversity. So what you're getting is my own view and not the Presbyterian view or
Right.
the official view, right?
Certainly not the entire Christian view.
Not
They didn't have a
not
meeting
even
and
close.
elected their spokesperson. Yeah.
Not even close.
Right.
As I said, I tried to narrow down my answer because I have a lot of answers to that question. To me, there's not just one that's adequate. So my first answer to that question is that Jesus was a person, a historical human being who had a family, who lived and grew up, who had a job, who traveled around the Roman province of Judea, healing and teaching and occasionally yelling at people, and and gathered a core group around him, and was for a time very, very popular with the average, the common people, and very unpopular with the powerful people. And that this person was, by whatever means, executed by the Roman Empire, executed by the state, and died and was put in a grave, and that was like a disaster for the followers that he'd surrounded himself with. That was a disaster for the people he'd become popular with, and that was like an apparent victory for the people he was unpopular with.
Right.
So leaving aside questions about the resurrection, what exactly that looked like, I do believe he was resurrected, but that's a parallel conversation that's a little different. But on a basic level, Jesus was a person, a human being who lived in the world, lived a certain life in a certain place, and died a certain death for reasons that we can mostly guess at, make educated guesses why it happened. So that's the first part. The second thing I would say about Jesus is that for me, Jesus is the image of God, the best image of God. So if I want to figure out what is God like, there are a lot of ways I can do that. I could look at the world around me. I could look at the natural world. I could look at history. I could look at other people. And those are all meaningful and sources of information. I could look at other wisdom traditions. But for me, the best view of who God is, what God is about, what God wants from me is in Jesus. Jesus is that best depiction of a person whose life is full of God, and a person who reflects God's intent for people the best, and the person who reflects God's character in a way that we can understand. Not an infinite being, but a person.
Came here as a human. Who
came here as a human
to in a different way, right?
And if you're going to take God and make God a human, as a way to know what God wants humans to be like, and on human terms, what God is like, Jesus is for me the best of those. Not the only, and maybe even not, by himself sufficient. I don't know. I have to think about that some more. Yeah. Because he is a person in a particular context, time period, limitations of what of his story we know, et cetera, et cetera. But best for me, best. And the place I start, my starting point, if I'm thinking about God, gotta have Jesus involved, or else I'm off the rails. Third thing I'd say about Jesus is that Jesus is a pattern. So Jesus is described in the beginning of the Gospel of John as the Logos. Translating Logos as word isn't that great. I'm not a huge fan of that translation, because there are There's a Greek word for written word that isn't logos. There's a Greek word for spoken word that isn't logos. So it's not that. But in Greek philosophy, the logos was like the governing principle of the universe.
Right.
It was like
the framework of everything.
Right. It's a framework of everything.
Yeah.
If you boil it all down, if you strip away everything, this is what's at the base function of the cosmos. And then people would argue, what is the logos? So John is saying Jesus is the logos. So Jesus is a manifestation of this fundamental pattern that isn't just in him. You can see it arising in other places, in other ways. And I like to think that you would discover this pattern even if there was never a Roman province of Judea with people expecting a Messiah. I like to think that you would discover this pattern. And
that might be part of how you see God in other places as well, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
That's visible in other traditions, in other people, and other right.
Yeah. So one of the things I do is I think about, okay, in this cultural context, separate from that one, what would the pattern look like? It's kind of a weird question, but that's one of the ways I approach it is like, what would the pattern look like in this place, in this time? What does the pattern look like? How do you detect it? How do you figure out where the pattern is, and how do you align yourself with that pattern, ideally? Because it's not just a pattern for the cosmos, it's a pattern for human life in the cosmos.
Yeah. Well, that's almost an analogous question to what would Jesus do then, right? Where do you see the pattern? Where do you see it now?
Yeah, that's another way of asking a very similar thing is where is the pattern, and how do I weave myself into it so that I'm part of it? And to me, that's one of the ways I figure out what a meaningful life is. What a purposeful life is. All right, how do I be part of the pattern?
All right. Well, at the risk of asking you a question I didn't send to you ahead of time because it fits so well, where do you see the pattern today?
So one of the indicators of the pattern is self-sacrificial love. One of the indicators of the pattern is where lowly people are lifted up, and another is where raised people are brought low,
brought down.
So flattening is part of the pattern. The pattern flattens, I think. The pattern loves, and the pattern loves in a particular way. In a
flattens
way that,
as in equalizes, it sounds
like. I'm sorry, flatten, not like crush you down.
Like
a flattened organization, like everyone has a voice, everyone has equal standing, but still diversity. It doesn't make everything the same. Like if there's any creator involved in the universe, that creator is interested in diversity. That's like unavoidable. That's
pretty clear.
It's very obvious that whatever made the universe doesn't want everything to be the same. That's profoundly obvious. So and I see that as part of the pattern for me.
So I hear your distinction, which I thought you might get into, between, there's sort of Jesus of Nazareth, maybe let's call him Jesus, the human who lived in that particular place and time.
Right.
And then there's a more mystical, may not be exactly the right word, but a bigger understanding beyond a human of who Jesus is, which is kind of one of the core distinctions of Unitarian Universalism from Christianity, was that generally we lean towards Jesus the man and a little less towards the bigger thing. So I'm curious, and you can kind of answer in both directions as we talk about this, but this question probably fits a little bit better if you're thinking about Jesus the man, which is like, who would he actually be today, do you think? What would he do for a living? Which I think is such a fun question. Like, would he be a pastor? Or would he do something else, right?
I think it's possible he'd be a pastor. I mean, he was, so I'm assuming we're taking historical Jesus, whatever we know of him, and just porting him to the present, right?
Like a very literal, what would he do? What would he do for a living?
Exactly. So I think Jesus would be in some kind of labor. Like economically speaking, he would be labor and not capital. So he would whatever Jesus is doing, it would be for like a paycheck. He wouldn't be an investor,
right?
He wouldn't be a crypto bro.
No.
He would be, Jesus would be, and maybe doing like physical labor, because that was, almost all of his life. He had a few years as a rabbi, acknowledged as a rabbi. The other 90% of his life was, as a child, and then as some kind of, a laborer, like a contractor, a builder. Because a carpenter would have done a lot of different things back then, just like they do today. So maybe he would do something like that. Of course, we have like a service economy, so there, and there wasn't much of a service economy back then, so he might be doing labor, in a service form of some way. But I see Jesus would be labor. He'd be getting a paycheck, and I think that he would be the sort of person who would be educated, in addition to that, or maybe on the side. Like somehow he was trained as a rabbi, even though he grew up as a carpenter. So he would work his job, his 9 to 5 or whatever, and then would also be going to school or, taking classes online or doing evening courses or that kind of thing.
Right.
Because he was also educated for his time, to the standards of his time. And he could be a pastor. I mean, I think of myself as labor. I get a paycheck. Yeah. I do a job. I don't have any investments. But yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure he'd be a pastor, but he certainly could be.
Well, and I'm also thinking about how in many traditions now in our current context, religious traditions, Christian traditions, other traditions, particularly where people's social locations might be different. Maybe they're not white and they're not owning class, they're not wealthy. In a lot of those traditions, traditional education isn't required to become a leader. So they do something more like an apprenticeship, and they're ordained without having to go to school for it. So again, if you kind of transfer his social location back then to what it might look like today, maybe that would be part of it too.
Yeah, very unlikely that he would be white if he was born in America. He was born to an occupied underclass. Yeah. And so, the parallel to that would be a migrant person at the border or an African-American person anywhere. I think that social location would also carry, would be my guess.
So picturing this Jesus in our world today, and maybe here's where it starts to blend a little bit, the historical Jesus and the pattern or the logos or the bigger Jesus. What do you think he would be proud to see that might have been different from his time back then?
I think that one of the things I think he'd be proud to see is how widespread Christianity is. Not that he wanted imperialism and colonialism to happen, but he did have, he was brought up and trained in the prophetic tradition in Judaism. And so one of the expectations of that tradition is that God's Spirit would at some point be poured out on everyone. Old, young, all nations everywhere. Like that was, God's promise to Abraham. I will make you a nation, and by that nation, all nations will be blessed. So there's that broad expectation that the culmination of history is this, Spirit being poured out on all people. And I think that he would look around at the world and be like, wow, this is, I couldn't have imagined, Christians in China and Christians in Africa, well, in South Africa or Southern Africa.
Gone way beyond his original 12.
Yeah. The first Christians were in Africa, but much farther, and Christians in new continents. And I think that would amaze him. And I think that he would also, another thing he'd be proud of is the development of nonviolent resistance movements. I think that's one of the things that he taught that was way ahead of his time. Things like the turn the other cheek, go the extra mile, give someone your shirt when they sue you for your jacket. Like those, I interpret those as methods for nonviolent resistance against the Roman Empire. I think that's what makes the best sense of those teachings. Yeah. And I'm not the first one to do that. I'm doing that because I read Gandhi and I read Martin Luther King Jr. doing that. Right. And I think he would be amazed that spread so far, that you could look all over the planet, every continent, many countries, and you can see resistance movements using those tactics, using those methods, some successful, some not. But it was more than just a few people in Judea during his lifetime. And I think he would also be, I think he'd be maybe proud of that, because you could see, like, okay, that one of the things I really cared about spread. Not everything, we'll get to that, but like, one of the things I really cared about, one of the things I really taught, people I could never have imagined existed when I was living in, Palestine, are doing those things. Not necessarily even because they're Christian. They just, it is a method of resistance that has spread.
Of resistance to empire and oppression, and
right. Yeah. And
a way of flattening in that equal way to bring justice. Yeah,
exactly.
Go ahead.
Those are a couple things that came to mind. I think
it's interesting that you talked about one of the things he might be proud of would be this sense that Christianity has grown and that his teachings have spread, because I imagine for you there's probably a distinction here, and I'm curious to hear you describe what it might look like. One of the hot topics in America right now, obviously, is this rise in public figures advocating for a kind of Christian nationalism, right? So, and you touched on that. You said not that Christianity has spread in a sense of empire, but that there is some distinction there. Obviously, Jesus believed what he was preaching, right, and wanted people to hear it. What do you think he would think about the fact that we have politicians in America who are advocating for Christianity to be a national religion?
I mean, I think he'd be furious and disgusted. Like, it's, I mean, in the records that we have of him, in the stories that we have of him, the only people he really gets angry with, that, calls them vipers and hypocrites, are religious leaders. That's it. Those are the people that he just has the least patience for, that he uses as examples of what not to do. He's like, when you pray, don't be like a religious leader. Do the opposite. When you give alms, don't be like this guy over there. Do the opposite. Like, he used them as the counter example in his movement again and again. And
because they were just doing it for show, or because they didn't feel it on the inside, or what do you think that is?
I think because they were doing it for show, they're doing it, performative religion is, and this is not new to Jesus. This is, the prophets are talk about this all the time, that, like, don't you dare have religious assemblies while you have injustice in your society. Don't ever, God would say, I reject your offerings given with hands that have been involved in violence just, moments before. Or if you're not paying your workers, don't you dare tithe to me. It was a lot, that harsh language isn't just from him. It's in the tradition. And so I think that would be something that was familiar. I mean, I think he'd see through that immediately. And it would be disappointing and heartbreaking, but not a surprise.
Yeah. Do you think Jesus would, what's the question I'm trying to ask? How do you think, I guess, he would feel today about this religiously pluralistic society that we were in? Like, how would he navigate that, and that tension of wanting to share his message with knowing that there are other ways to understand God?
Yeah, that's a good question, because
it's a totally impossible question, I realize.
Yeah, these are all impossible questions. And again, you're getting my view, not the view in any means. Because he lived in a religiously pluralistic society.
Absolutely.
Right? The Roman Empire famously didn't care what your religion was, as long as you burnt some incense for the emperor on his birthday and
paid your taxes
and didn't try to resist. They didn't care what you thought, So he, in his life, would have been surrounded by people practicing other religions from North Africa, from West Asia, from Europe, Greco-Roman, religions, as well as Judaism. And so, in his case, Judaism was his focus.
Mm.
Like he was very focused. Like he talked to some Samaritans, but they're, very much adjacent culturally.
Yeah.
Didn't spend a lot of time debating in the marketplace with people of other religions.
Mm-hmm.
So that, maybe would be, if I'm answering from the standpoint of Jesus, the person, I think the focus might be, we need to look at Christianity and get this right before we have anything to say to other people. Like if we
focus on his own community,
right?
Yeah,
and like we need to look inward and be like, okay, we have some, and the idea of look at the log, deal with the log in your eye before you look in the mote in someone else's eye.
Yeah. And all religious traditions have that work to do. All human communities do. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But I could totally see him taking that tack of being like, okay, we need to fix what's going on here with us,
right,
before I have anything to say about what other people are doing in their own traditions. I'd also be curious, like, my interpretation of the pattern, is that true? Would that be some element to that as well? And his public statements, would he talk about what he sees in other religions and as reflecting his own priorities? But I could see we have so much work to do, and from my point of view, are so largely off the rails in a lot of ways that I think there's plenty there for a lifetime of very hard work to just address how far we've drifted.
Yeah. Well, there's plenty of debates amongst his followers. There's no shortage of different interpretations of what he taught that have now turned into different branches of Christianity. So
and there were arguments at the time too. Like I think that would be familiar. Like, there's a strong thread in Jewish culture of like, let's debate this, let's argue this out.
Yep.
That's the method of interpreting in a lot of ways is an educated argument. Like that's
a dialogue.
And one way of interpreting the Bible is that it is an argument. It's a discussion. That's one of my favorite ways of interpreting the Bible, is that it's a conversation, sometimes an argument, and then when we read it, we're invited into the argument, we're invited into the conversation. But the idea that it's one book with one message is crazy. You can't have read it and come away with that.
Yeah. You can't get past the first 2 chapters.
Yeah, there's
another creation story. Yeah,
there are answers to questions like, why do we suffer and what is a good life, there's an argument about that in the text. And I think that's intentional. They could have assembled a different text if they didn't want that. So for like 1,000 years, people wanted an arguing text, and then for 2,000 years they argued about it, that we have in the Talmud and the Midrash. So the diversity, I think, wouldn't bother him at all. That would be home base. But the drift from his priorities has been enormous.
Christianity has had some mission drift. That perhaps.
Yes, we've had some mission drift. Yeah. And we have a lot to repent for and a lot to, seek reconciliation over. Like, there's a lot.
So I asked you a little bit about what you think he would be proud to see if he were living in our world today. What do you think would maybe most break his heart about our world today?
One of the things that gets me as an observation regularly is how many different ways the early church was much more radical than the 2023 church. So he started this movement where women had higher status than in other movements at the time that we know of. That women were ordained to positions of leadership. We just know that for a fact.
Yeah.
It's not arguable. Women were prophets, women were apostles, women were, patrons of the church, hosting gatherings. A movement where things were shared in common. It was communalism, sell your possessions and share, and then find the poor and the widows and the orphans and bring them in, right? and how there was always this concern for like the status of slaves at the time. Like in the early church, we have texts from the Roman Empire mocking the early church because they see it as this effeminate religion because women have status and slaves have status. And they're like, what a disgusting religion. Like, how can they even be there, right? So all these things that at the time were quite radical, not entirely unheard of, but pretty radical. And now you look at the Southern Baptist Convention and there's none of that there. There's just, I'm just picking them up to beat up on because they're the biggest denomination and they've been in the news a lot lately. There's just none of that, and in a lot of the Roman Catholic Church and the Presbyterian Church, it's just, we are still not as far along as we were in 100 CE or 200 CE, which is just, I find that devastating sometimes. I just think like, what is it going to take, And I think that would really, this could just be projection, of course, because it breaks my heart, but I imagine that would be very demoralizing to say, wow, 2,000 years later, you've got airplanes and, satellites and iPhones, and you still have, misogyny? Hold on. What? What?
Well, and you have all of these people following Jesus now, right? But in these certain aspects, they sound much more like my critics than they do like anything I ever said. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Exactly like my critics.
Exactly like them.
Yeah.
And in some ways, not even as radical as the tradition that he had, the rabbinic tradition. Like, there's still most of Christendom wouldn't accept like Deborah, and she was a big deal judge in the Hebrew scriptures and the religious and military leader of Israel. And she would have no place in 90% of Christianity, which is just, man, or at least a majority. I don't know about percentages. A majority, I think, of churches would be like, no, you can't be in power.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if this is meaningfully different than what you already answered about what you think he would do for a living, but I guess I am curious because I feel like that question of what should we do in response to injustice these days is also very active. The Black Lives Matter movement takes a very in the streets approach, and there are people arguing about, as they always have, pointing fingers, say, don't protest like that, do it like this, right? Don't take action like this, work from the inside, or get elected, or vote, or there's all these different ways that we can take action. Do you have any thoughts about what you think Jesus's suggestions would be to us today who want to change things in terms of actions that he would encourage people to take, or how that might show up today?
Yeah, I have thoughts about that. I think that Jesus would, one thing he would affirm is the need for work on ourselves. Not just first, because that means I can't protest until I'm perfect, which
will never happen.
It's another way of saying don't protest, right?
Right.
But the need for interior work along with exterior disruption and protest and action and organizing. Recently in a book group in our church, we read King's letter from a Birmingham jail. And so in that, he kind of lays out the nonviolent direct action process. And there's like a 4-step process that they would apply to decide, are we going to have a nonviolent direct action in this place? And one of the steps was self-purification. But they look inward and they're like, am I able to be taunted and struck without striking back? And am I prepared to endure jail? Am I prepared to go to jail? And if your answers to those are yes, then they would also do some trainings and role playing and that kind of stuff to get people ready, because it's very difficult. But that was always part of it. Like you train yourself. I forget who said it, but there's this quote that like, we won't have peace until people are willing to train for peace as hard as they train for war. So you need to like really put time and energy into this. So I think he would affirm that. because he had a lot of things to say about work on yourself first, or work on yourself. Don't lash out with a log in your eye over a mote in someone else's eye. Not that injustice is a mote. And I think he would encourage disruption. I think the whole idea that you shouldn't protest in a way that disrupts is ridiculous. And of course people don't like it. Of course it's uncomfortable. It's supposed to be uncomfortable. That is the point. For a lot of reasons, it's a way of taking a situation for a person that's uncomfortable every day and reflecting some of that on the larger society.
Right.
And saying, like, my life is interrupted every moment, so I'm going to interrupt your traffic during drive time, and I don't care. Like, yeah, get angry.
This is what it feels like.
Isn't this frustrating? Wouldn't you hate to live this way forever?
Right.
Come join me, And the things he talked about were, he disrupted flipping over tables in the temple courtyard and driving the animals and money changers out with a whip. That's really disruptive. That was the core of the economy of Jerusalem at the time. Like, that was where they made all their money. So that's like emptying Wall Street. It would be disruptive. Our 401ks would look worse. So Jesus was clearly willing to do that. And I think that he would encourage others, as he did in the Gospels, to do that. Not to cause injury, not to do harm, not to, strike back, but to disrupt. Yeah. And so I think, it'd be some combination of work on yourself and disrupt.
In his time, Jesus left his followers with teachings in the form of parables, with instructions on how to pray. He seemed concerned with kind of leaving people with a teaching that they could hold on to and work with in their daily lives. So if he were alive today, do you think that there would be a teaching that he would leave us with that would feel particularly vital to him, that would be reflective of the times that we're in now? Because he was very reflective of the times he was in then. He was paying attention to his context. I wonder what you think about that.
I think that one of the things he would probably provide are new parables. I'm not prepared to provide one today, obviously, but like, but just think about, so what, for example, in films, like, what makes a ton of money are parables about good and evil. Like, that's what Marvel movies are about. That's what Star Wars movies are about. I haven't seen the new Avatar movie. That's probably what it's about. The first one was very much a parable. The second one's probably a parable. It's my guess.
Just this time with whales.
Yeah, exactly. So there's hunger for that, because it's a powerful way to move people. And in our society, we have functioning stories, functioning parables, or I guess I should say dysfunctional parables in a lot of ways. I think part of why so many people are struggling, expressed through things like rising suicide rates, rising violence rates, rising mental health issues, etc., is that we have stories we're trying to live in the midst of and live out that are dysfunctional. That they're just like, if you do everything our culture generally tells you to do, you will suffer and not have a good life. That's a serious problem, that there isn't like a path that you can just go along. Because most people aren't like you and me. Most people don't have the privilege of thinking about this stuff all day and talking about it on Zoom, right? They're clocked in work right now. So for those people that don't have that privilege, like, the life that you're handed, the path that you're handed by default, is a path to destruction, of the natural world, of yourself. And so one of the things I think that we need are powerful stories that are different, that take hold, and so that a person can, without putting thousands of hours into a seminary degree or whatever. That someone can just live a regular life and kind of, learn wisdom from the people around them and be okay, and die relatively happy, relatively few regrets. And then some people will be extraordinary and some people will fall short, but it takes so much work to be human in our society. It takes so much extra effort, to have empathy, to care for people, to remember what's important. That's not good. We can't expect that from everyone, because people they have other stuff they have to do in their life.
Yeah.
So what I guess would hope for, and maybe in a large sense, it falls on people who claim Jesus, to provide some of these things, which in some ways, small ways, I guess I try to do. But if Jesus was here today, I think one of the things he would provide are powerful parables that would reframe the way that we live our lives and the way we figure out what our priorities are, that would help us, that would last. The way that his original parables have lasted a very long time, because they did that in that context. Even 2,000 years later, we still get it for most of them, and they're still meaningful. So, but some modern parables that did the same thing in our context would be very helpful.
Yeah. Well, and I think that is what we try to do as pastors, as religious leaders, is take that tradition and find the relevant ways to talk about the stories that are surrounding us now that are not helpful in our lives. The stories about make the most money that you can, the stories about be superior to others in this way and that way.
Do anything for attention.
Do anything for attention. Look
attention
a certain way.
Attention is the same as a good life.
Yeah. Look a certain way and you'll be happy on the inside.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a million of those powerful stories. And I can relate to how frustrating it is sometimes to feel like our stories are so small in comparison and have a much smaller budget for publicity than these big ones do.
Yeah, I think man, the other stories have 160 some hours a week.
Yeah.
And I get 1 hour. And it's
Well, and maybe that's, like you said, you're not going to come up with one right now either, and also maybe that's just the difference between us and Jesus, or someone like Jesus, right? He whatever we might believe about who he is and was, at the end of the day, he produced some stories that lasted 2,000 plus years. And that says something. So,
and still challenge us. They're not just, because there are, reassuring, comfy stories that last a long time, because we read them and we go, but these are troubling stories and challenging stories where you read them and you go, ooh, I've got to work on myself, or I've got to do something in the world, That's amazing.
Yeah. Good job, Jesus.
Well done, Jesus. You get full marks.
Doug, thank you so much for talking with us today.
This was a lot of fun.
This has been great. I really appreciate it.